Well, hello and welcome to the AATG podcast. Today, I'm very pleased to be talking with John Willinsky. John is founder and co-director of the Public Knowledge Project, which is based at Canada's Simon Fraser University. PKP is probably best known for the open journal system, open preprint system, and open monograph system. So, welcome, John.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here. And let me start not with a correction, but just a clarification. The Public Knowledge Project is largely located at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, but it's also, I'm a retired faculty member at Stanford University, and it has an outpost, if you like, or has a situation there. And also as a retired faculty member, I'm no longer a co-director. Juan Pablo Alperin is the scientific director of the Public Knowledge Project. So I'm still working, doing research, and I'll talk about some of the things I'm still doing in the project. But I've stepped back a little bit, and after 25 years, and given others a chance.
Great. Well, you've answered the first two of my questions already. um, so let's begin with your background. I think you mentioned you're Canadian. Yes.
Yes. I was born in Toronto and taught at the University of Calgary and the University of British Columbia. I taught school. In fact, this whole project, I think, has its roots in my background as a school teacher for 10 years in the town of Sault Ste. Marie in Ontario. It was that experience of teaching kids to read, to excite them about learning, that really got me interested in public education and in the potential, in particular, of research as a source and resource of public education.
So this is a question I've always wanted to ask. How do children learn to read?
Yes. Well, we have an hour. I can certainly explain everything there is to do on it. So it's actually quite controversial. And I would say that I was the witness of children learning to read more than I was the teacher, because it is something of a mystery. There are elements in which they have to learn the structure of the language, phonics, as we talk about, the sound and letters relationship. There's a great deal of context they need to bring to their reading, and motivation. In fact, I would reverse that. I would say motivation is number one, an interest in what's on the page, a context in terms of what is the general topic that's being talked about, and then an ability to decode, if you like, or to analyze difficult new words. And that soon becomes automatic, but the context and the motivation, constant. And that's why we see, for example, adults able to read research that we think is way above their level because they're highly motivated. They have a child, for example, who's ill, and they're curious about the background and the research that's been done. So the notion of reading as a fixed capacity, a notion of reading as something that you learned in school and then you finished learning, no. It's an ongoing process. And I'd suggest you take away these three concepts then of motivation, of context, and structure.
Clearly, you've thought a lot about the way that reading is acquired and how it works, and perhaps that's what led you to become a teacher of teachers, as it were.
Yes, I'm not sure. There's an expression about those who can't teach and those who can't teach teachers. So I don't want to pursue that too far. But I had an enthusiasm for learning. And in particular, it's interesting that between the public library and the public school, I often thought that I was more inclined towards the public library, and this is the work I'm doing now, creating a large public library of research, than the teaching of school. But my life has been divided between the two. The first half was certainly, my professional life was certainly consumed in classrooms. And the second half more on building this notion of a public knowledge project. What a great title.
Absolutely. Well, let's come back to that in a moment. But just to finish off your kind of research activity, you've actually authored, I understand, several books. So as a sort of full-time researcher, so you do have credibility as a sort of full-time researcher, quite apart from your public advocacy.
Well, the credibility is still in question, I think, but the books, yes, I'm a great fan of books and an author of a dozen books, in fact, in areas of publishing, initially in literacy, and in education, where I was doing my work. The impact of imperialism on education was a topic of one of my books, books on literacy in particular, new forms of literacy. But then I moved on to scholarly publishing in my research. I've done a history of the intellectual properties of learning, to look at how scholarship contributed to our notion of intellectual property, going back to the monks, the monastery, St. Jerome, and trying to understand where we would get this idea that research should be free, should be on a different economic basis than other forms of publishing. And it does come from a long tradition in which researchers were very concerned about the intellectual properties of work and very interested in the sharing of them, knowing that the properties of the work they were doing were enriched by the sharing of others. And so it was a very different economy, very different rewards, very different values in the research tradition, which was much older than the publishing tradition that we think of with Charles Dickens and novels and newspapers, and the way it's been inherited today, where intellectual property is not about scholarship. It's all about the earbuds you're wearing, and the phones and the video and media.
Absolutely. So would you describe yourself as a primary researcher or an advocate for open science?
Many hats. I need, my head, I need many hats. So I think it's a matter of a researcher first. And we've tried to lead. I mean, I am a professor. I wasn't paid to teach or to do research that was strictly advocacy. It had to be based on research and scholarship. But out of that, the Public Knowledge Project has always been informed by our research, and we continue to do that. We continue to look into questions of indexing, for example, and integrity, the protection and representation. How do you signal research integrity? And that's really a question. We'd say an empirical question that needs to be investigated. There's no logical kind of answer to that so much as a research one.
So let's talk about the Public Knowledge Partnership, which I believe started around 1998. So tell me how it began.
It began in a kind of, I was a professor of education, and I had just received a small endowment from the local newspaper. And so I decided to do a project with them as a professor of education to kind of pay them back. And the newspaper would cover computers in the schools, 1998. This was a very big topic, still is today, but those days it was still fresh. The internet highway the information highway was well underway. And so I said we would bring the research to the newspaper, and the newspaper would bring the reporting, and we would form a bond between research and journalism. And to me, that public aspect. Now, 1998, the newspaper was only in print. 1998, 90% of journals were not online. But what I found out was there were some, is that I couldn't bring the research to the public. I couldn't use research articles that were in the university library because the copyright arrangement was that it could only be used by members of the library. So I couldn't share online the research. I was embarrassed. I worked with the reporters to bring the research, and I was limited. I could bring the abstract, the title. I could summarize it. So it was a moment of revelation for me that there was something terribly wrong with this picture that I, as a teacher and as a professor of education, did research on schools, on children, on communities, parents, and their involvement in education. And I wasn't allowed to share that with them. They would have to come to the library, pay for parking, and come to the library to see the research. And this was the age of the very early days of the information highway, not the very early days, but in the first decade. And things were being shared. I was able to start a rock band because people shared the tabs for music. And I was able to play in a way I'd never been able to play before. And so I thought research should be something similar, a public good that could be shared. So I decided to put my endowment from the newspaper into this public knowledge project. How could we make research public? And I called it a project rather naively, thinking that it was a project. I do lots of projects. 6 months, a year? What do you think, Michael? How long would it take to get all the research in the world free once I told people that it was the best way to share research? Well, we are now 25, 28 years in, and we're looking at maybe 50% of the research, current research. Not just me, many, 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 hundreds of scholars, not thousands, maybe thousands. No, certainly, there's 70% of researchers want to make their work. So we're talking millions of researchers want to make their work freely available. But there's still limits, there's still constraints, and we are still engaged in this project. And I cannot predict when that project will be over.
Gosh, it's an amazing story. And what I find remarkable is that it started so early, 1998, which actually predated the open access movement. So, what's the link between PKP and open access? Did one lead to the other, or was there any kind of relationship?
We were not part of the famous Budapest statement about open access, which really was the formative moment. Many of my friends were involved, who became friends. We actually started the notion with free to read. We thought that was like a catchy title for it. But the spirit of it, there was no question. Once open access caught on as a name, we were totally in. And we have been devoted to developing a platform, open source publishing platform, open journal systems, most widely used in the world now for journals. And we developed forms of economic support for open access journals, subscribe to open. We were part of that formation, that concept. And we're working now on ways of increasing and improving integrity with the publication facts label. So we've been involved at multiple levels in the open access movement, but I'm not sure it's a movement anymore. I think it's now a norm. I think it's now an expectation. I think there's a consensus that I wish we would take more advantage of. That is, all of the major publishers and minor publishers in most cases, the scholarly associations, the researchers themselves, the funders, the librarians from the very beginning are all recognizing open access is the very best way that for the sharing of research, for the contribution that it could make to other researchers, as well as to public education in my interest, but also professional work, whether it's government agencies, physicians, other professions.
Yes, although as you say, there might be a consensus in agreement of the principles, but we haven't quite reached the sort of the 100%, which is an interesting one we'll perhaps come back to. Just to clarify, you mentioned that you moved to Stanford subsequently. So how did what was behind the split, or the sort of your transfer to Stanford rather than remaining in Canada?
It's interesting. So I was at the University of British Columbia. Let's just do a little bit of history here in Vancouver. When I started the project in 1998 with an endowment from the Vancouver Sun, and actually from the Pacific Press was the owner of the Sun. So I started it at the University of British Columbia, but the Simon Fraser University, which is a second university, as it were, in the Vancouver area, had a greater interest in the project than the people at UBC. So the library at Simon Fraser University reached out to me. So in a strange way, the project then took root. This is around 2005 at Simon Fraser University, where I was not a professor. I did get an honorary degree there, but still, it had that association. So when I had the opportunity to come to Stanford, which was a very exciting prospect for me, I decided that the project was well located at Simon Fraser University. And I was already working at a distance, very short distance, 10 miles. What would it mean if I moved down to Stanford, at 1,000 miles? So we then continued to work through the library at Simon Fraser University and through projects that I had at Stanford. Stanford contributed a great deal. Research grants, research assistants, amazing contributors who are still part of the project. The current scientific director, Juan Pablo Alperin, got his PhD at Stanford. So we've had a close affiliation. We're working now with Stanford University Press, Simon Fraser University. So it is It's somewhat arbitrary, I suppose, in a way, but it's a reinforcement of the friendship and relationship that is currently a bit strained and under a great deal of pressure between Canada and the United States. And so it's just one more example of how the two countries and the association, we have support from the Canadian government, and we've had support from the American government, National Science Foundation, for example. And in Canada, the Canadian Foundation of Innovation has been supporting our project. So it is a tale of two countries, and continues to be.
You mentioned contributions. So how is PKP financed? Because it's does it have any income?
Yes, it has revenue. So I can quickly break that down for you. And in fairness, both institutions, Simon Fraser and Stanford, are what can I say, the bankers, or are the fiduciary institutions that have a responsibility for the project. And our funding sources are largely, we think of them in three piles, as it were. The research grants I mentioned already, a very important aspect. And those grants are both for innovative research and as well as maintenance of the software and its development. That's one source. We have membership, and a wide range of memberships that include libraries, largely. Hundreds of libraries are involved. Research institutions of other sorts. Publishers have been supporting us. So we have a membership basis because the software is free. Anyone can use it, anyone can download it. But the third source of funding that's actually grown in importance is that we provide a hosting service. So you can use OJS, the Open Journal Systems, freely, download it, or you can ask us to host it, upgrade it, do customization. So we have 52 or so, actually more than 52,000 journals using Open Journal Systems freely, with no obligation to us. And except for, about 800 or 900 of those journals are hosted by us, and they pay us an annual fee. So three sources of income: research grants, membership, and hosting services.
And do you have full-time staff?
Yes, we better for that kind of, yes, we have we're between 40 and 50 right now staff members. That's technical team, that's management, that's community support, that's hosting services. So we have research affiliates, more than a dozen, who work with us in the research side of things. So we're an organization. We have a director of operations, Kevin Stranick, who manages all those different parts across two countries and two currencies. But in fact, we're in and have relationships with countries around the world. We're very big, as it were. We're used quite widely in Indonesia, have a representative there. We work in Europe. Germany is a very strong participant. The Nordic countries are, the UK, we have representatives there, employees. So we're a global institution in a way, or at least have that membership aspect. We're distributed. A good example, Michael, is languages. So Open Journal Systems is available in 30 languages. The research is being published actually in 60 languages, but the software is not available in 60. But that's a remarkable, I just want to pause for a second. That was a great discovery for us, that research was being published in 60 languages, because we often think it's all English and maybe some Spanish and French and Portuguese. But in fact, research is a global enterprise, very multilingual, very diverse. So our translations of the software, which again are between 25 and 30, are all done by the community, all done by volunteer contributors, all managed by an open source system called Weblate. And so that community participation is a critical aspect of open source software.
I remember you reading somewhere about another innovative aspect of your whole operation. You have something called the PKP Sprint. Tell me how that works.
Ah, yes. Any runners in the audience? It's not for you. The Sprint is a workshop and really a technical development concept where we gather people together in a community. I was in one recently in Turin in Italy. And so from around Europe, with the 3 or 4 members of our team, just a small core group, gather together and we take on particular things people would like to see developed, particular aspects. One of them, open review, for example. How do we develop a good open review system for open journal systems? And open journal systems is not only open source as software that is freely distributed, easy to download, it uses a plug-in architecture. So that means you can develop a plugin in the course of a sprint, which is 2 days, maybe 3 days all told, 3 days of very intense programming. You develop a plugin, and that becomes an option that's distributed freely and widely. And it enables you to upgrade the software and keep adding new plugins without having it, the term is forked, without having it in a state where it can't be upgraded. So we have hundreds and hundreds of, OJS has hundreds of plugins that have been developed by others and by us in multiple languages. And the sprint is the perfect case of coming together to build a plugin or some other aspect of development. Sometimes we do policy. Sometimes we look at issues of usability, accessibility at the sprints, but it's 3 days of our community. And for us in the project, we're distributed. There are a few people in Vancouver, living in Vancouver. There are 2 of us here in San Francisco. We don't get together that much. And so when we come to the sprint, it's a wonderful opportunity, and we rotate who goes to the sprints. Norway, Oslo's our next sprint coming up in June.
Sounds great. So Open Preprint Server, one of the big components of the OJS system, did that develop through a sprint, or presumably that wasn't there right at the beginning?
No, that has a wonderful story where we had a donor to Stanford University, a very generous anonymous donor, and our timing was amazing. This is 2018, 2019, right pre-pandemic. And so and preprints at that time were certainly catching on, but there was no medRxiv, for example. And bioRxiv was bioRxiv was a strong contender, but it certainly was a good example. So we decided it's not part of OJS, it's based on OJS. So we have 3 major platforms: OJS for journals, open journal systems, Open Monograph Press for books, and Open Preprint, the most recent, Open Preprint systems. So we were fortunate enough to be able to release it, in 2020, and Cielo in Latin America, largely in Brazil, headquartered in Brazil, was our first user and was part of the development of it. And it played wonderfully into Latin American contributions to research on COVID. It's used in Japan, it's used in Japan as well, and other sites around the world. So it's not as popular. The preprint is still an emerging form. And the relationship between preprints and reviews, for example, is an evolving question. So we are, in a sense, trying to be responsive to the community with the development of open preprint systems. We use a common library, so anyone who uses OJS, Open Journal Systems, will be very familiar with the way the open preprint systems work. And we try to build on the notion of a common platform and library to create a more efficient and to make sure that all of the developments within one are shared by the other 2.
Sounds great. So when PKP started, 1998, I believe Archive was already running at that time, but did you have any idea at that time of how big preprints were going to become?
No, Archive was a huge inspiration. I mean, Archive goes back to the early 1990s, so it was at the beginning of the decade that we were at the end of. And I would say Paul Ginsberg has been an inspiration to us. So that was the first example that research could be freely shared, could be shared as preprints, and interestingly enough, wouldn't affect the journal economy. Physics journals were still among the most expensive, even though everyone was going to archive.org. The lesson that I learned was that there were 100,000 physicists going into archive.org every morning. Oh, excuse me. And so in that sense, it was a preprint that didn't catch on to other disciplines for a decade, more than a decade. And I think it was the the example that physics set, that is that it doesn't need to be published in order to learn from it, that people went into archive to see the immediacy of the research and build on it, and that the published version still ended up in archive and the journal economy wasn't affected. I thought when I first learned about it, this is it, we're done. We don't need a public knowledge project. Archive will spread through the whole of the scholarly publishing world. Well, as you laugh, and as rightly so, it didn't. It took some time to catch on, and in some ways, archive is still unique in the kind of community and engagement, not just for particle physics anymore, but still. And the particle physicists have been leaders in multiple ways. The Scope 3 agreements, now the journals are all open access, not just the preprints. So it's an interesting group. I always think it's because they're high energy physics, they've got that get up and go, but that's a bad joke. Sorry.
That's the existence of archive is, as you say, nonetheless quite domain specific. It hasn't sort of been replicated in every other domain. When you talked about open preprints, you mentioned that that initiated or was very strong in Latin America with Cielo and that community. So do you think it's the case that there's also regional groupings in that way, where practices sort of develop into a community in a sort of within an area?
Well, this is the interesting question with preprints. One of them, at least, is it disciplinary or is it regional? I think MedArchive was a very important contribution because medicine was absolutely opposed pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. The risk factor was too high. And the experiment and the natural, I mean, to call it natural, is the tragic natural experiment that COVID represented for preprints was that, in fact, it made a huge contribution. And there were retractions and there were articles that never got published because they weren't of quality. Absolutely. But the risk factor in terms of we need a vaccine and we needed other scientific contributions overcame that. And so I think the demonstration was hugely powerful in terms of the contribution. And it absolutely contributed to the consensus that open access is the best principle. And I appreciate your point, Michael, that there's agreement in principle, not in practice. So, but still, that we've reached this point after the pandemic, that in principle, open access is the best way. One of the kind of ways I've thought about this, or I've talked about it, in fact, is the number of pandemics it will take till we get practice, open access practice as a universal. And I say that not cynically, but just on the idea that we shouldn't have to have another pandemic. Absolutely not. But that we should be moving more quickly. I'm frustrated by the pace. I know 25 years and something is nothing, but for me, it's long enough. Come on. It's a project. So I'm hoping that we can continue to increase the pace. And I'm frustrated by transformative agreements and other what I consider to be very slow processes that are not transformative in the way that I think we deserve and expect.
Let's look at this regional aspect in a little bit more detail, because I think it's true to say that OJS, the Open Journal System, is used by you've got an incredible number of journals and articles published on it, but a very high proportion from the Global South. So do you think that emphasis in the Global South has an impact and lends itself to sort of the way you develop the tool and the service?
I think you need to understand that in the Global South, there's been a development and a growth of higher education there hasn't been in the North. That I think between 2008 and 2020, there was a doubling of the number of institutions of higher education. Whereas in the Global North, there was a very small increase in that period. So we're seeing a great number of new researchers, a great deal of research going on, and there was no capacity to share that research. And there was a legacy of imperialism and colonial attitudes that also inhibited respect and interest. So OJS filled that vacuum. It wasn't a matter of anything clever on our side. We just provided a software platform for growth, an area of growth. And the software being freely available and open source meant that it could easily meet the needs. So that's the kind of explanation I would provide for it. I think the challenge that we face now is the one of how do we create an integrated system? Because if we have 52,000 journals, and I would say 80 to 85% in the global south, you're absolutely right, Michael, they're not being indexed at the same rate as in journals of the global north. They're not widely available through the major indexes. Google Scholar, to its credit, we've worked with since 2004 to ensure that we're close to 90% of the journals that that use our platform are in, and we don't publish, by the way, so I have to be careful about how I word that. These are journals using OJS. Mm-hmm. But the indexes that people rely on, like Scopus and the Web of Science, have very, very low coverage. Mm-hmm. And so the global integration of the knowledge that's being produced is a major challenge that we face, because that knowledge is freely available. We're about 90% open access of those 52,000 journals. But many researchers are not encountering them. And many researchers are a little unsure and question journals from outside of their community, outside of what their advisor told them to respect. So we have prejudices to overcome. We have technical challenges around the integration and indexing of this basis. We have new kinds of indexes like OpenAlex that are working on new principles and are doing a much better job, but are still working on this global integration. And I would say the distance between integration and integrity is very small. That is, if you're not consulting the whole of the literature, it undermines the integrity of your claims for your research, which always begin with a literature review that may be biased and partial because of the current indexing situation. So I see that as an issue. I'm excited about the global expansion of research and participation in research. But see us now, and this has been a research question for us in the Public Knowledge Project, is how can we improve? We're working with OpenAlex. We've worked with Google Scholar since 2004 on this. How can we improve that integration, that ability for researchers to consult the whole of the relevant research for their work and increase, as it were, the integrity of their claims?
Do you think it's just the number? You mentioned the sort of the dramatic growth in the number of higher education institutes in the global south, leading to this perhaps the sort of reason why OJS has been taken up so enthusiastically. But OJS must be in a sort of a very strong position of having a higher proportion of these publishers than most other sort of organizations. So do you think there are any insights you're gaining from this these extensive links and involvement with the global south?
I think, to be fair, the price point was an advantage we had as a platform. The fact that we're free, and I think it is a regional support. Indonesia is a good example. It's one of it is our largest, no question. Not one of. It definitely is the largest user of OJS, and it has organizations, NGOs, non-government organizations that support journals and use of OJS. So there's a community force that goes beyond anything that we do that reinforces that. There is the question, and I respect this aspect and see it as an element, that is the question of quality. And I would, and in particular, the threat of predatory journals, the concern about predatory journals, and I think we should need to address that. So we've taken it very seriously. As a question, and we've done an analysis of Cabell's list of predatory journals as well as Beale's, and we're under 2% of our journals on those lists, and we've been able to correct those lists in some of the cases. Some of those journals should not have been on that list. So we've addressed it that way, but we've also created, and again, the response to predatory journals, I think, is again another indication of a colonial legacy, of a tradition of suspicion around the global south that needs to be addressed. So it's easy to say don't trust if you don't know, if they're not part of your community. And so as a way of addressing that, we have developed this publication facts label that works at the platform level, at where we develop the software. So it is plugged into the platform and gets the data automatically and presents for every article How many reviewers? How many days to publication? What's the profile of previous reviewers and editors and board members for this journal? Conflict of interest statements and funding, sources of funding, as well as data availability, all on a simple, which we've designed on the basis of the nutrition facts, a simple label that has live data comparing with other journals, is one way of addressing that. So we take our responsibility around trust and the trustworthiness of research very seriously. We take this need to recognize that this is a new world of research where you have, I mean, how many journals are there in the world, Michael? It's, I don't answer that because it will be wrong. And it is, if we're at 52,000 journals using OJS, that suggests, easily over 100,000 in the world. And again, the idea that we should be worried there's too much research, we should be, and I've seen articles that address that topic. And I think it's more a matter of we need better indexing systems, because there's no particular piece of research that you want to say, no, we have too many. We want to see it all. And the research and the indexes, as they get better, you will see less, in fact. You will see more of the relevant only studies for your work. And you'll be able to pin that down very precisely. And that's why research into the use of AI, into the use of further markup languages that allow you to identify aspects of instrumentation or methodology of the research are all important steps that we need to take into the future. So rather than retreat into the safe bounds of what you know, I'm hoping that we'll see a global integration of knowledge, making a substantial contribution in the years ahead.
Tell me a little bit more about the publication facts label. I understand there are 8 criteria. How confident are you that everyone understands what those 8 criteria are?
I'm confident because we started in high schools, testing the label. Now it was grade 12, grade 11 and 12, so it wasn't just kids. These were mature teenagers, but we have been very concerned. I'm a public educator, so this is where I start with public education, and that was our starting point. So we didn't put in, for example, is there a clinical trial registry? We didn't put in whether they did chi-square analysis versus some other statistical method, because we wanted that legibility as a basis of trustworthiness. But we think the days to publication, number of reviewers, we also want to educate the public about this. What's different about research compared to other forms of publication, like social media, like TikTok? Well, actually, TikTok has a lot of peer review, I have to say. But that was a bad joke. But let's stay with the principles of research. So we provide a small label with a link to a big explanation of each of the points. There's actually 11. And we try to provide this as a source of public education for new authors, for current authors who are thinking, should I cite this research? As well as for professionals and students. And so it's been, and science journalists was another group we consulted. High school students, science journalists, editors, early career, faculty members or researchers have all been part of the consultation process. And we're still developing the label, so it's not over.
Can I understand though that the publication facts label, but can it not be falsified like other aspects of an article if people choose to?
Anything can be hacked, Michael. So don't ask me for a hack-proof solution, please. But what the integrity of the label, though, is based on the fact that the editors and the publishers cannot enter data. They would have to reconstruct in HTML that document in an exact form. We're using a very standardized look and feel. So all of the data comes automatically from within the publishing platform. Like days to publication is a common standard within the system. So it's not that it can't be hacked, but that it is very different than just printing the label. It is integral to the platform itself. So this is for OJS. We want to see this, and we're working now and have had interest from publishers I can't name and platform developers. They haven't committed. The Directory of Open Access Journals has endorsed the label, but that's as far as we've got so far in the endorsements. So it can be developed for any platform. It would have to be engineered differently for different platforms, obviously. But the principle of the integrity, that is the integral integration into the platform, is, we think, a very strong way to go in terms of that. And then you can run checks on whether it's been manipulated, whether the data is actually coming from within the platform. So we see it as a very secure approach. We see it as immediately legible to people. You can see it and it's, immediately that it has the label. You can look at the details. You can argue whether 60 days versus 120 days to publication. But for an author, that difference is very important. But for a reader, no, it's not really significant. Three reviewers versus 2, no. But 1 reviewer, and we'll give advice on disciplines, because one of the interesting things I've learned is that in math, I may have this wrong now, but at one point I was told that in mathematics, a single reviewer was pretty common because the proof is the proof. And it either stands up or it doesn't. So we will be able to advise people on a point of comparison. The average for the field is 1 in mathematics, therefore 1 looks good. If the average for the field is 3 and it's 1, then you say, not so good.
It sounds fascinating. I'd love to see it develop. And do you think it's true to say that your position as although there are many providers of journal platform software, your position as a sort of a neutral, open source leaves you in a better position to create initiatives like this compared with more commercial providers?
Yes, I would say we're not neutral, because we are very strong advocates of open access, and we're very strong advocates. For example, we're quite active in the field of on APCs. We're not neutral on those. We're developing subscribe to open as an alternative to APCs. But we are neutral in the sense that our software is free and we don't have a profit motive behind the label. It's freely available open source software. And we do have support for its development. So it's a contribution to the field. We're doing all the technical development. I mentioned the donor previously who did the preprints. That same donor is backing the label, has a great interest in research integrity and public access. So I think the industry is beginning to recognize that this is a contribution where the investment and development and initial trialing of it has all been taken care of, and they're welcome to come and participate. So we've had, the interest, in fact, has surprised me. I thought it would take longer for people to come to the table, to want to see it, trial and everything. Right now, we have 100 journals, over 100 journals that are trialing it. And coming up with a question. Users are getting a single question about its value and asking them, are they from the public or the universities? So we are in a process of proving it as a concept, and we're engaged in conversations with publishers and platform developers who see that, in fact, it wouldn't take a great deal to develop it for their particular platform and their journals as publishers.
You mentioned that you're working with a recent initiative like Subscribe to Open. Does the Open Journal system work with initiatives like Publish, Review, Curate?
No, Michael, I'm sorry, there's a bit of noise. We're going to have to get a little of editing here. I've got a street sweeper going by, and I didn't hear your question.
So the question is, you mentioned that that OJS works with recent initiatives like Subscribe to Open.
Yes.
Does OJS can it be used for systems like Publish, Review, Curate? These kind of very recent models.
Yes, so it is a very flexible system. It can be used for traditional subscriptions. It can be used for APCs, even though we are somewhat working on the other side of that. So the new developments that eLife has been introducing, for example, would work well. We're developing a version of that for the Open Research Europe platform. And ORE is going to have a similar kind of curatorial aspect to it, in which preprints and publications will be continuously reviewed and through an iterative process. So we pride ourselves on that flexibility. It's not. I mean, there's a question about, is it modular? Do you take, is it like Lego? Can you move the blocks around in that kind of Lego way? No, it's an integral system, But we have things like quick submit, where you can jump the peer review for an editorial and go immediately to the production aspects of it. So we have flexibility built in. We are respectful of the publisher's wishes. That's why we have an APC component, why we have traditional subscription components. We see the publishers as having the ultimate responsibility for the quality and for the publishing model, and we respect that.
Let's talk a little bit about the bigger picture. One of your academic positions, which made me smile, was Professor of Literacy and Technology, but literacy, and particularly AI literacy, I think is a very important concept. Do you believe in there being such a thing as AI literacy?
Yes, I think there's complexity behind that, Michael, but on the surface, and believe in the sense of the church, no, but the believe that we need to be literate about AI. I mean, this is the pressing question right now. The literacy and technology, that's interesting you picked up on that, because that was from my University of British Columbia days. And I thought it was I was the professor of literacy and technology that was funded by the newspaper that had no technology, that was still in print, and that was not barely literate, that wouldn't be fair, but was not at the forefront of literacy in our community. So there was a kind of irony to it. But I think the key element for me is that literacy and technology now are one. There's very little that you read. Even the book that you hold has been printed electronically and came through electronic forms in terms of the book itself. I have books on my desk here I could point to. So I think that those two come together. The AI question is a profound one. I think the generative AI, the large language models, have introduced a whole new level of thinking about language. So I am working on a project, and I won't be go into it too far, about this existential crisis that we have, that for the first time we have a machine that can reason, that can think, as it were, and that can match our language and exceed our speed in remarkable ways. The cogency of the prose that it produces still surprises me. And so I think we have to deal with that. And I've just been looking into Descartes, who spoke about a talking machine and said it had a limit, of course, because it could never engage in a conversation. And that stood until 2022, when ChatGPT came into the picture, and it engages in conversations. It's engaging in conversations every minute of the day. So I think there is a new aspect of that, and the literacy that's involved, and it comes down to how do you prompt these systems. Prompt engineering is a literacy question. What texts are included? How do we create some discipline around this use of language? So all of these things are new educational questions. What it means to teach a child to read now is going to change because of that. How we think about research. So there are many, there's still questions before the courts on the intellectual property rights of these large language models' use of Sarah Silverman's work.
So you're not a believer. You don't have any sympathy with those who hold that digital content is addling our brains. The sort of the lack of the move away from print. The statistics like only half of the U.S. public read a book in the last year. Sort of it somehow spells doom for our brain power.
No, I am concerned. I'm well, you can't see, but yes, I live by the book, as it were. So that is an aspect. It's the unit of thought I like to think about when I went around books versus journal articles versus TikTok and everything else. So there are absolutely concerns about those. And if I was still a professor of literacy, in that sense, as opposed to, I think of as a professor of scholarly communication now around the sharing of knowledge, that would be a pressing question. So there are absolutely, Michael, and I think you're opening doors to bigger interviews or longer and discussions at least, and starting with your first question about how do children learn how to read. I think it's a matter of an open question. And I tend to try to work on very narrow aspects that we can resolve, like the integrity of a journal article. How do we tell that in a moment? And then, as I say, I'm looking at Cartesian questions about changes in philosophy as a result of large language models. So trying to keep both of those aspects makes it very interesting, but very hard to summarize in a single interview like this.
Sure. Well, here's another very open question, but I think hopefully you'll forgive me. I think it's very pertinent. Let's imagine. I think you said once that only around a third of the entirety of scholarly literature is available to the public. I mean, the figure may have changed a little bit, but it's still a small proportion.
Yes.
So let's imagine for a moment that 100% of the scholarly literature is now available. Everything can be read. But will it increase public understanding of science? And if not, what else do we need to do?
Very good question. Okay, so yes, it would increase public understanding of knowledge, but by what percentage? What point? There are always people interested in science. When I was a kid, the magazines were Popular Science, Popular Mechanics, and those kinds of engineering and scientific were on the newsstands, and they had a readership. So there is an interest, and today many blogs and many other aspects attract interest. What I see is there's a just-in-time kind of attitude with research and science. That is, I need to know this at this point because something in my life is affecting it. My child's going to go to a Mandarin immersion school. What should I know about Mandarin immersion in terms of my child's growth and development and education? So I think that people have a right to this knowledge, and I believe they have it even if they don't use it. So I don't think it's a matter of establishing, just like the voting process. You don't have to vote in order to earn, you don't have to sort of prove that you have a right to vote. You have that right. So I think that is a key aspect. But I also think we could do better in educating students to the world of literature, the research literature. So we have educated students in science as if they will never have access to research because they wouldn't have. And so part of the work we're doing around the research label, around the publication facts label, part of the work we're doing is developing a high school curriculum that introduces students to the standards of scholarly publishing because they are going to have access. They have half of the current literature is freely available. And I would still say more than a third, more like closer to 3/5, maybe just over. Sorry, not 3/5. Sorry, 2/5. Is that more than a half? No, it's less than more than a third. That's less actually. So forgive my math at this point. But the sense is that they will be have increasing access. That's the one thing that I'm certain about, even if I've got my fractions messed up here. And I think that they can expect to learn more in schools about that. We have a responsibility to educate the public for public access, which we haven't before. And that responsibility will meet halfway with this interest, with this sense of, I'm curious about this today, I'm not going to look at it again, or something has come up in my life I do want to know about. And that principle of just in time is very important, even though just in case the curious, I want that to be encouraged as well. I got school to kind of feed that curiosity and direct it towards what I thought were important and interesting areas of knowledge.
Well, I'm confident, John, that having tackled and to a large extent solved the problem of public knowledge, I have every expectation that you'll move on to public understanding and sort of crack that one as well, and sort of in the coming years. Anyway, it's been great to talk to you, John, and many thanks for your time and your insights.
All right, it's a pleasure, Michael, and I've enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.